Here we have Geography Now, Bulgaria. I don't know a ton about Bulgaria. When I was first introduced to Bulgaria, it was, of course, through professional wrestling, as I was introduced to a lot of countries for the first time through professional wrestling. They had a Russian wrestler who was actually a Bulgarian, pretending to be Russian. And then eventually they're like, nope, actually he was Bulgarian the whole time. It's pretty stupid. But that's how wrestling is. They assume that nobody would know where Bulgaria is, and then eventually they're just like, yeah, he's from Bulgaria. So that's a thing. Fun fact, from 2011 to 2021, Bulgaria has lost 11% of its population. It's the worst demographic decline in Europe and probably the world. Jeez, I hope they're okay. Um, when did this video come out? It certainly came out since then, so if any statistics or whatever are outdated, let me know or whatever, but that's a thing. Jeez.
Bulgaria. Where have I heard that before? Oh yeah, Victor Crumb from the Harry Potter books. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, now you want to watch this episode, right?
Oh yeah, I forgot he was Bulgarian. Oh, what an interesting character that was. Well, only in the books though, not in the movie. The movie, he was just like, eh, eh, eh.
It's time to learn geography now!
Hey everybody, I'm your host Barbie. I'd like to take this moment to coin a term, tripster. A tripster is a travel hipster, someone who is so over the mainstream tourist destinations and they only prefer to go to the bleakest, most obscure regions of the planet. That being said, tripsters watching this video, take notes. Also, let's dissect the flag. The flag is a tricolor consisting of three equally sized horizontal bands, white, green, and red. When it comes to symbolism, even Bulgarians themselves aren't 100% sure exactly what each band means. However, it's generally accepted that they are inspired by the Pan-Slav nationalist movement colors. However, it's also kind of accepted that these are the definitions. The white represents love and peace and freedom and spirituality. The green represents the youthfulness as a new liberated state, agriculture, character, and the beauty of nature. And the red represents the valor and, once again, the blood spilled of those who fought for the country and for the heroes.
People are so uncreative. It's not even funny. Let's just stop putting red on flags if we're not going to come up with something interesting.
Area. Okay, that was kind of easy. Moving on. Very few people actually know where Bulgaria is on a map, but when you look at it, you'll
It's just that Bulgaria isn't the wealthiest country. People are leaving Bulgaria to find jobs in other countries, primarily. Random white circle, thank you for that. That is a good reason why you would have the population going down. I'm glad it's people exiting and not like massive numbers of deaths or just because of like an unfortunate declining birth rate or something triggered by something bad. Like that sounds a little bit better to have just people leave and go to find something better, at least. Though it does imply that things are not going too well.
That its position is kind of important to the entire continent of Europe. First of all, Bulgaria is located on the eastern part of the Balkan Peninsula, bordered by 5 other countries and the Black Sea to the east. Since Bulgaria is Europe's closest point to Turkey, it's kind of seen as like the crossroads between Europe and Asia. The capital is Sofia, located in the west, and the country is divided into 28 provinces, and the capital Sofia acts as its own province as well. Sofia has a wonderfully unique ambiance as a city that still retains its residue shavings from the former Soviet identity, but with a modern westernized democratic appeal that exudes through the billboards and media. About 80% of the border with Romania rests on the mighty Danube River, and the borders with Serbia, Macedonia, or the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and Greece rest on the mountains and hills like the Balkan Range, the Pirin Range, and the Rhodope Range. Bulgaria is very lucky because in addition to having a nice geological mountainous shell to encapsulate the eastern side, they have a wonderful Black Sea to the east, which has played a heavily influential role in the development of the Bulgarian nation. The coast is classified as a humid subtropical climate zone with an abundance of pristine golden beaches, the most popular ones off the coast of Varna and Burgas.
I know when playing Geography Now, I got dropped somewhere like over here, and it was like, sorry, you can't even see, somewhere, I think it was closer to where Burgas, however he pronounced that, I was closer to that, and it was beautiful. It was just a fantastic looking place.
In the Black Sea, Bulgaria owns 5 small islands and islets, each named after a saint and each with a unique charm and backstory. For example, St. Thomas Island is one of the only places in all of Bulgaria where cacti grow. St. Ivan Island, which supposedly has the remains of John the Baptist from the Bible, and St. Anastasia Island, which had a jail that prisoners escaped from long ago. Bulgaria's land comprises of a lot of history, to say the very least. In the south, by the Gorna Krepost, you have the Perperikon, the Thracian city ruins of the strange ancient culture of the Thracians. In Kazanluk, you have the Thracian tomb of Kazanlak. Yeah, the ancient culture of Thrace had kind of a lot to do with this area. Nobody quite exactly knows what the downfall of the Thracians were, but reading into historical accounts on how they acted on a regular basis, it's not that hard to speculate on a few probable theories.
We're sociopaths.
Yes, you are, Thrace. Yes, you are. Now, of course, the monuments tell a funny story, but the natural land formations get even crazier. The Bulgarians have a saying: when God divided up the nations amongst the people, the Bulgarians were late, so instead God gave them a piece of heaven. Now, whether or not you agree or disagree with that, you can't deny the fact that Bulgaria does have some
so
pretty nice
arrogant.
grounds. First of all, the country is divided into 2 general topographical areas: the mountainous east with the Balkan, Rila, and Rhodope ranges, and the low-lying flatter Danube Valley and the Gorno-Trakiska lowlands, in which multiple rivers and lakes can be found, in addition to the majority of agriculture plots and grazeland for livestock. Speaking of which, if there's one thing that Bulgarians are proud of, and I'm not even joking, every single Bulgarian I talked to has mentioned this, it would be their unique yogurt. Now, a lot of countries make great yogurt, and people will tell you that the Balkans was actually the birthplace of yogurt. However, Bulgaria is the only place in the world where the yogurt is fermented with the Lactobacillus bulgaricus culture that is only found in the air of Bulgaria. This bacterium gives the yogurt a distinct twang and flavor unlike any other yogurt, and with the milk coming from cows or sheep that typically graze off of high herb-rich pastures, enriching the product with even more health benefits. You come to Bulgaria, we don't mess with our dairy products. You buy it, you buy it! Of course, you also have the Black Sea, which Bulgaria has been dependent on for centuries for trade and business, but also has been capitalizing on for tourism. Many Europeans consider the Black Sea coast as kind of like their secret getaway spot that nobody really knows about, because everybody's so concerned about thinking that Barcelona and Nice are the only places that you can go to. Ugh, Valencia? I've been so over that for years. I prefer Burgos. Of course, you've probably never heard of that. Now, here's the cool thing. Because of natural borders by mountains in conjunction with wind and weather patterns and water flow, Bulgaria is home to a wide variety of entertainingly strange natural landmarks, such as the Belogradchik eroded rock cliffs, the stone mushrooms of Beliplast, the Popti Kamani stones. Also, keep in mind the Popti Kamani area, in addition to the Tabernas region of Spain, is one of the only 2 naturally occurring deserts in all of Europe. And then we get to something that Bulgaria is definitely not in short supply of: caves and waterfalls. We reach places like the Devil's Throat Cave with the world's highest underground waterfall, the Devatashka Cave with holes in its ceiling, the Eyes of God Cave in Prohodna. In fact, Bulgaria has over 4,500 charted caves in its entire country. Also, keep in mind, 32 of the 37 species of bats in Europe call Bulgaria home. So if there's one thing you can take away from this, it's that Bulgaria is a very cavey place. Waterfalls also speckle the landscape, mostly in the eastern mountainous regions. The tallest one in the Balkans being the Resko Praskalo, the picturesque Krushuna Falls, and the town with the most fortunate fairy tale view, Vrasta, which has the Skaklia, a waterfall looming above their skyline on the mountain, ever flowing from the cliffs adjacent to the direct vicinity of their town.
Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. I just can't even.
Now, if you ask Bulgarians, one more thing that they'll tell you that they're proud of is their roses. Roses are cultivated all across the entire country, but most heavily in the Rose Valley, just below the Balkan mountain range. Bulgaria produces over 70% of the world's rose oil, a substance used by pressing on the petals, and also
that's not something I would think about.
They have so many roses that typically the abundance allows them to have rose festivals in which they parade around with roses, have a rose queen beauty contest, and they kind of just end up dancing around and throw roses all over the place. Kind of like the La Tomatina festival in Spain, except it's a lot cleaner and more better smelling. Wow, that's the second time we've contrasted Bulgaria with Spain. Let's see if there's any more parallels in
demographics.
Now, Bulgarians may be Slavic, well, kind of, we'll explain more about that in a bit, but they definitely have their own Bulgarian.
I'm kind of confused as to where Slavic begins and ends sometimes. I've referred to places as Slavic and had people be like, but like it's kind of hard to tell sometimes where that's appropriate to apply that or not. And I've said that with Bulgaria, and I thought I was right, but I'm glad if there is some ambiguity, he's going to let me know.
Bulgarian way of doing things. Bulgaria has a population of about 7.5 million people, most of whom identify as ethnically Bulgarian at about 85%, 9% of the population being Turks, about 5% are Roma, commonly referred to as gypsies, making Bulgaria the country with the third highest gypsy population, and the remainder of the country coming from other nationalities. Now, here's the sad thing. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Bulgaria has one of the highest population declines in the world. They used to have around 9 million people back in 1990, but since then the emigration and death rate has surged past the population growth rate, and since then Bulgaria has seen a rather alarming population decline in the past few decades. This all had to do partially with company privatization and the social structure investments going completely out of whack after independence from the former Soviet Union. Statistics project that about 60,000 people leave Bulgaria every year, and in 2012, 24 towns were completely wiped off the map as they were completely abandoned, and about 170 towns are on the verge of extinction. The good news though is that this makes Bulgaria one of
I know that happened with a lot of smaller towns, like small factory towns in the Soviet Union, because a lot of towns were built around like single industries. I remember seeing a video about a town that was like being held up specifically by this one paper factory that really wasn't all that productive, and they were just keeping it open because if the paper factory shut down, the town would be done. Everybody was employed by the paper factory. I'm pretty sure this one was actually in Russia, though. But to see something like that, to see similar problems in other places in the Soviet Union makes sense. I'm sure they had a lot of like one factory towns elsewhere as well.
the perfect places for cheap shopping, real estate, business, and cheap vacation getaways. In fact, since recently joining the EU and NATO, which has by the way caused a lot of controversy, Bulgaria has seen a completely unprecedented level of tourism and business booming. Yeah, economic nerds, Bulgaria is the kind of place where you might want to consider pulling a Warren Buffett. I'm just saying. Ethnic Bulgarian people will tell you that they have roots from the Bulgar tribes, which nomadically came from the eastern regions of Eurasia as far speculated as the Central Asian regions until they eventually settled down into what is now known as modern Ukraine. Eventually they came down and mixed in with the Slavs and formed Bulgaria. So technically, a lot of people in Bulgaria could have Central Asian roots, and considering how far the Huns extended their reaches, that's not completely out of the question. Culture-wise, Bulgaria is proud to proclaim itself as the birthplace of the Cyrillic alphabet, used by over 250 million people in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, extending as far as Mongolia. Oh, and one more thing, just like we talked about in an earlier video, like some regions in Albania, Bulgaria is one of the only few places in the world where people shake their head to say yes and nod their heads to say no. Now let's talk about the people Bulgaria interacts with. Now, Bulgaria has one of the most anomalous core of companions that you would never really expect them to engage with comfortably. First off, the strange thing is, in 2004, in addition to other former Soviet states, Bulgaria took a bold step and joined NATO, and 3 years later joined the EU. This was kind of a big deal considering the Soviet-linked past and the ties that Bulgaria was rooted in. This move also opened up Bulgaria's diplomacy to unparalleled standards that they never really had before. All this kind of puts Bulgaria in a very unique intercessory class status when it comes to East versus West. Typically, Bulgaria will kind of act as like a mediator for the EU and NATO when it comes to cross-operational engagements. When it comes to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, commonly referred to as just Macedonia, Bulgaria has a strange relationship. By all means, these two countries speak the same language and have pretty similar backgrounds as Slavic nations. The problem is where things went down about 80 years ago. Basically, this is what Bulgaria says. Look, Macedonia, we want to love you guys. You're basically just Bulgarians, but you've been brainwashed by Georgy Pilevsky into thinking you have some kind of indigenous Hellenistic roots. You don't. You're Bulgarians. Just accept it. To which the Macedonians say, "Shut up, Bulgaria. You don't know us. Okay, we are descended from Alexander the Great. You belong to Macedonia." I don't want to say it's kind of like the North-South Korea thing because it's nowhere near that level of animosity, but in a fundamental sense, ideologically, it is kind of like the North-South Korea thing. They generally do not favor Turkey that much because for 500 years they were under the Ottoman Empire, and they pretty much hated every second of it. It wasn't until the 19th century when they finally gained their independence with the help of the Russians fighting alongside with them. This means that Russia is kind of seen as like the brother friend of Bulgaria. Even though in every aligned organizational sense, they kind of took every step away from Russia. And
look at their flags. You look at two countries with very similar flags and you can tell they get along.
Even though they were kind of taken over by the Soviets for a long time, tensions are low and they still get along great. However, Romania is kind of seen as like the new boyfriend that Bulgaria just started dating. Especially after joining the EU, relations grew fast. The presidents regularly visit each other and hang out. Business is great. Ferries and bridges connect the two countries across the Danube, where people love to visit each other, and Romanian-Bulgarian marriages are not uncommon. In conclusion, wax your mustaches and put on your skinny jeans, because if you are so over the mainstream, you might want to just stop by and smell the roses. Stay tuned, Burkina Faso is coming up next.
Yeah, I'd like to do some more today. We could do Burkina Faso. At least Burkina Faso. I really enjoyed learning about Bulgaria. Bulgaria is any former Soviet nation is inherently kind of interesting. There's so much interest, and they were a former Ottoman nation, which I totally forgot about. So there's a lot of occupation history there that is definitely worth learning a little bit more about. Let's see. I don't know anything about Burkina Faso, so that could only be helpful.
Hey, Geography peeps, so we're back in Africa, and you came just at the right time, because as of the upload of this video, Burkina Faso is going...
Of course it's Africa. Like, you see the color of the flag, and it's just like, it's got like red, yellow, green. Like, yeah, that's a very African flag, series of colors for a flag.
Going through a huge transition, and find out why in about 3, 2, 1...
It's time to learn geography now!
Hey everybody, I'm your host Barbie. So Burkina Faso is one of those African countries you've probably heard of that has a lot of drama going on. However, there's a whole world of underlying fascination and culture awaiting for you once you...
Don't assume I know anything, dog.
That being said, let's dissect the flag. The flag has two equally sized horizontal bands of red and green with a yellow star resting in the middle. These colors are the Pan-African colors to symbolize the breaking away and unity of post-colonial nations in Africa. Adopted in 1984, the red symbolizes the revolution, even though the guy leading that revolution would eventually get assassinated by another guy leading another revolution. And the green represents the abundance of agricultural and natural resources, which...
Revolution, blood of the martyrs, you know, basically the same thing.
I'm not trying to be offensive, Burkina Faso, but that's kind of not really true, but if you say so. And finally, the yellow star represents the guiding light of the revolution. All right, that's pretty much it. Moving on. Okay, first of all, Burkina Faso is arguably the country with the world's most interesting sounding names. I mean, you have places like Borum Borum, like a car, and then you have places like Borum Borum, like a Swedish car. I don't know. There's a place called Rambo and Bobo Dioulasso. A lot of these names come from tribal words, and the cool thing is that Burkina Faso is actually really good at intermixing its ethnic influences pretty well. In fact, the name Burkina Faso comes from the Moore word Burkina, meaning honorable people, and Faso, which is the Dioula word, meaning fatherland. The usage of different languages in the name symbolizes the unity between the many ethnic groups. It would kind of be like if Canada called itself La Pays Parlementaire Fédéral Nation of Canada. Oh, même pas un rêve, il neigera en enfer avant que cela arrive. Sorry, we're getting ahead of ourselves, and we haven't even shown that Earth is
let's not get into Quebecers.
Can we do that now? Ah, great, here we go. Okay, Burkina Faso is landlocked, located in West Africa, surrounded by 6 other countries, and is divided into 13 administrative regions, each with its own governor. The capital is, get this, the name of the capital is Ouagadougou. I just can't. That is just, I love, it sounds like a dance move.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I gotta teach you guys geography or something like that. Burkina Faso's old name actually used to be Upper Volta, or French Upper Volta when it was part of the French Empire, named after the 3 Volta rivers. The black, the red, and the white Voltas, which also would explain the former flag. You might ask, well, if it was called Upper Volta, then where was Lower Volta? Was it Ghana? To be frank, no, there never really was a Lower Volta. However, all 3 Volta rivers do kind of drain into Lake Volta in Ghana, so I guess in an unofficial sense, Ghana is kind of like the Lower Volta. When it was under the French Empire, Burkina Faso was kind of utilized as like a bridge nation and wasn't really exploited much for its natural resources. The country was pretty much targeted solely for the purpose of giving direct access from the coastal colonies to the desert holdings like Mali and Niger. Yes, people, that's how you pronounce it. Niger, not Niger, not Niger, and definitely not that offensive word that I know you're all thinking about and getting all 13-year-old Japanese schoolgirl giggly about, Bob Saget. It's pronounced Niger. It's kind of weird because 19 provinces in Burkina Faso.
I've been guilty of calling it Niger many times. I know Niger is the better way of pronouncing it. Sometimes I'll say Niger and not even really think about it.
Have like this weird fusion contiguous territory agreement with Mali and Niger under this thing called the Liptako Gorma Authority, which basically administers the resources and power cooperations between the peoples of the entire region of all three countries. It's kind of like, we're all from three different countries, but let's pretend like that doesn't really matter in this one specific region. Deal? Deal. Otherwise, Burkina Faso has quite a few noticeable places that have their own cultural flair. Typically, towns will have their own contrasting architectural style based off of the tribes that are predominantly inhabiting that area, like the thick red clay houses of Kumi, the elaborately embellished pattern houses of Tiabele, the spiky mud mosque of Bobo Dioulasso. Otherwise, Ouagadougou has its own taste in modern buildings and offices, but with a dry red clay African ambiance that gives its distinct cultural character. Want to know another thing that gives Burkina Faso its character? Burkina Faso's landscape plays a huge role in how people live and engage with each other on a daily basis. First of all, as a landlocked country, Burkina Faso obviously has no access to the sea, so instead relies on its system of rivers and lakes for irrigation. Remember how we talked about the Sahel in the Benin video? Well, the northern part of Burkina Faso is kind of like entirely in it. This means that the northern region of Burkina Faso, appropriately named the Sahel region, is the driest part in the entire country and has a desert-like atmosphere. The further south you go, the greener and wetter it gets until you are literally in humid forest zones. In general though, one thing that you can kind of expect in Burkina Faso is a lot of red dirt. The soil in many parts has a noticeably dusty red hue that kind of gives the entire country a rustic African appeal. Unfortunately, as a whole, Burkina Faso doesn't really have many internal natural resources, there's no oil, and many of the cash crops aren't really extensively grown. Despite the fragile...
So it doesn't have a lot of natural resources, and that probably would have contributed to why it wasn't exploited as much. Like, if you can't be exploited for as much, there's not as you're not as likely to be exploited.
Soil conditions, about 80% of the population lives on subsistence agriculture. In fact, despite plagues of locusts, desertification, and drought, about 3/4 of the people still live in the countryside and prefer agricultural lifestyles. It's just a thing they do and have been doing for centuries. The French colonial administrator R. de la Vignette wrote in 1946 that we came from industrialized Europe where factories are joyless affairs and found people who work to music. Typically, drummers still accompany farmers in Burkina Faso to this very day. The most common crops distributed domestically and internationally are peanuts, millet, sorghum. However, the economy is heavily centralized around cotton and gold. Burkinabe cotton is some of the cheapest cotton you can buy on the market right now and comes in very good quality. Gold found in various mines scattered throughout the country respectively make up an almost equal share of an export sector, and together collectively gold and cotton alone make up about 70% of all exports. Nonetheless, Burkina Faso still has a few impressive geological tricks up its sleeve. One of the most recognizable natural landmarks of this country would be the Sindhu Peaks near Banafora. These curiously eroded rock formations dispersed among the terrain give a wonderful visual experience, almost on par with the Hunan province rock pillars in China. But adjacent to the falls is another strangely eroded rock formation with stone ledges carved in an almost ovular fashion. Now, Burkina Faso's land may be on the brink of surviving, but the people sure know how to look good in the process.
Demographics.
Okay, just in case you didn't get it from the beginning, the people of Burkina Faso are called Burkinabes. Got it? Good. Burkina Faso has about 17.5 million people. The ethnic majority at about half of the entire population identify as Mossi from the Mossi tribe. About 10% are Fulani, Lobis, Mandes, and Bobos. Each make up about 7% of the population each, and the rest of the population is comprised of about 60 different tribes and people groups. Faith-wise, somewhere around 60% of the country follows Malachite Sunni Islam, heavily influenced on the doctrines of Sufism, whereas about 30% of the country identifies as Christian. The remainder typically follows some form of animism and traditional beliefs. The country's official language is French, however there are 3 regional languages that exist. More, mostly spoken by the Mossi, Mandinka, mostly spoken in the west by the Bobo, and Bambara, mostly spoken in the north close to Mali. Although Fulfulde, the...
I have a professor who's from... I'm trying to think of where he's from. I know he's from an African country that was previously occupied by the French. And French is one of his languages. I'm gonna have to ask him where he comes from, because that's actually a really interesting. I learned a lot about African colonialism from him, and I for some reason can't remember where he comes from. All I remember that it was a French colony at one point.
language of the
it might have been
Fulani is also
Burkina
widely
Faso
spoken.
for all
It
I
doesn't
know.
really encompass any specific region as they're kind of widely spread out throughout the country, so they don't really get a regional recognition.
Could've been
And here's the
anywhere.
thing, Burkina Faso is a pretty low-income country. Most people live off of $1 a day, and the country depends heavily off of aid from the IMF and World Bank. It's also one of the countries with the highest birth rates, as women typically on average have about 6 children each, which in return has exploded the population almost fivefold in the past half century. Now, in order to understand Burkina Faso, you have to kind of understand what has happened to it and what is happening to it today. In the shortest condensed way I can put this, shortly after the French left and they gained independence in 1960, the country got a president who was later usurped by a revolution led by Thomas Sankara, who acted on Marxist ideologies, often referred to as the Che Guevara of Africa. Sankara was then assassinated by another guy named Blaise Compaoré. Eventually, he was taken over by the storming of the parliament by youth revolts. Compaoré resigned and fled the country, and the ruins of parliament are now a tourist attraction. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations with political and military leaders, the country elected retired diplomat Michel Kafando to act as an interim president until November 2015, when elections will determine a new leader. So as we speak right now,
so
Burkina Faso...
this has been sorted out. We just don't know what happened yet. Okay, so if anybody has any updates on Burkina Faso, let me know. I'm gonna have to actually look into this. I've thought about, for future streams, just doing like themed content where I do just a bunch of videos about like one particular subject or place. Burkina Faso, from the looks of it, could be just from a political perspective, could probably have a lot of material to work with there.
is in a state of legislative limbo. In a few months, we'll find out what Burkina Faso will decide and what direction they'll head into. As we mentioned before, there are many tribes in Burkina Faso. However, the largest one, the Mosi tribe, has historically been the predominant ethnic group in the region. Mosis, like other tribes found in the region, have a heavily equestrian culture, as they are sometimes referred to as the cowboys of Africa, which may explain the huge profusion of horse race betting shops found in the country. French horse races are broadcasted live, and Burkinabes love betting on them. This gave them a huge advantage over their southern neighbors, as they were even able to effectively fight off the Atlantic slave traders very well in the early 16th century and remained intact for over 400 years until finally the kingdom was taken over by the French at the end of the 19th century. The cool thing is, according to Mosi tradition, the highest position in Mosi society is the emperor. The emperor, referred to as the Mogonaba, and the current one being Zomwogbo. He is recognized as an authoritative figure and holds substantial power and influence in the country to this day. These days, rugby is actually a little more popular than soccer, especially since Fulgence Ouedraogo was drafted into Montpellier Hérault RC rugby team. He's kind of like a local hero, and since then, Burkinabes have swapped kicking for tackling. Sounds like every roommate situation I've been in. Now let's find out who else Burkina Faso likes to kick, tackle, or hug.
Friends.
When it comes to friends, Burkina Faso is kind of like, nous ne sommes pas nécessairement amis, juste simplement parce que nous parlons français. That being said, Burkina Faso does kind of get along with, or at least tolerates, all of their immediate neighbors and have multilateral agreements, but they aren't exactly yippee-skippy about all of them either. Historically, they have had kind of a lot of conflicts with almost every single one of them. Nonetheless, it's kind of interesting because Burkina Faso does have kind of okay relations with the EU, even though former President Compaoré has been heavily criticized over the decades, and yet chooses to acknowledge underdog areas like Kosovo and Taiwan, effectively cutting off ties with the People's Republic of China and Serbia. Libya is a huge ally.
That's ballsy.
Both Sankara and Compaoré were both close friends of Gaddafi, and eventually both countries became founding members of the Community of Sahel-Sahara States, an organization that aims to establish free trade in the area. Interestingly enough, Algeria is actually not part of that club, and it all had to do with some kind of political dispute, yada yada yada. When it comes to their best friends, however, more or less they might begrudgingly say the Ivory Coast and Ghana. Even though they've had some drama with the Ivory Coast during the recent civil war, as they were accused of supporting rebel fighters, they still remained the largest trade partners and were at one point the same country under French rule. Ghana has established numerous ties with Burkina Faso, and today they have regular high-level consultations and cooperation commissions, and they even share joint military exercises with each other to encourage diplomacy. In conclusion, Burkina Faso is a land ridden with kings, cowboys, and cotton and conflict, and right now they're in a very tense moment of transition. Burkina Faso. And that's kind of where the camera ran out of memory space.
Oh.
Burundi is coming up next.
I thought something bad was about to happen there. Okay. I guess I'll call it there for geography now. That was a blast. Burkina Faso, it's always the countries that I'm not really thinking about that are kind of the most fascinating because I have the most room to learn about them. But like most countries, I could serve to learn a good amount from. So, Burkina Faso was pleasantly interesting, complicated, and there's clearly a lot that went on between when this video is made and now. So there's some material that's going to have to be caught up on. So I understand that very few of these age perfectly, and that's to be expected, I guess, from a series as old as this. He's been doing this clearly forever. So we're going to be getting into more geography now next week, where we will be picking up with our friends in Burundi. So that should be a good time. All right.